Welcome back, everyone. We're going to move to Greece, to the ancient Greek civilization. And what we're going to see are, with regard to the depiction of human figures, are a few things. First of all, the evolution of anatomical proportions and the human form, this relentless Greek quest for perfection. We saw it in architecture. We're now going to see it in sculpture. We also see at this time the emergence of the named artists. In the ancient world, the tradition was not that artists always signed their works, but we're going to see this in ancient Greece. And really this quest for order, balance, symmetry, idealism in the human form, it reflects the Greek social order, religious belief, and political structures. Just a review, we're actually not going to look at just a whole lot of depictions of Greek deities, but I always think this is a helpful review to remember that there were, ancient Greek is a polytheocratic society. They practice polytheism. There are many Greek gods and goddesses. All right, let's start with the Archaic period. This is not going back to the earliest emergence of Greek civilization around 1000 BCE, but what's important about the Archaic period here is the development of freestanding sculpture, or sculpture in the round. And we're going to see the koros and the kore. We're going to look at two different examples. A koros is a nude male sculpture. The kore, or the female version, is clothed. Sometimes as a votive figure, sometimes as a priestess, sometimes as a deity. But oftentimes we are not quite sure the identity of these. And I will say that the koroi and korai, there are many, many surviving examples. We're just going to look at a couple. Okay, let's start with this koros that's named the New York Koros simply because it's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And we see this notable athletic quality of the figure. We see interest in depicting defined muscles and musculature. And the figure is nude. It's not clothed like the Mycenaean warriors, for example. That kind of removes him from a specific time, a specific place, a specific social class. There's this kind of timelessness about the koros. And we see this is very typical for the treatment of the hair here, this kind of beaded hair that's a little bit more abstracted, a little bit more stylized. And then we also see something that's called the archaic smile, named after the Archaic period sculptures. And that's because if you think about how to carve a mouth on your face is rounded, it's not a flat surface. And so in order to kind of capture that, what happens is that these archaic era sculptors, they end up carving these little half smile fixed expressions as they're working on setting the mouth in a round face. And so the lips get turned up at each end. In other ways, though, this work is very naturalistic, as I said, in terms of the attention to details. But some of the proportions are off, right? The head feels a little bit too large for the body. The feet are kind of big and clunky. The shoulder-waist ratio is also, seems to be a little bit stylized. Here, just to go back to an Egyptian example, this is Khafre enthroned, that we looked at a few weeks ago. We can see here a little bit more, they're both kind of static, but we see, of course, in Khafre all of those expressions of political power that we don't have in the koros. All right, let's look at the female equivalent, the koroi. And she wears the traditional dress called a peplos, hence the name peplos kore. Remember, all of these statues would have been painted with garish, bright colors, and we see a little bit of remnant of pigmentation here. She would have had bright red hair. There's also um, small holes in her head that suggest that she would have worn metal jewelry, so metal earrings, a metal crown. But also, we have, again, another example of a more naturalistic figures. There's a kind of softness in her face. We see the bone structure here. We see naturalistic facial proportions. We also see the kind of, almost the kind of fleshiness of the arms as well. All right, let's move on to the early classical period. And when we talk about classical Greece, this is when we talk about the kind of golden age of Greece, the construction of the Parthenon, for example, that we've already explored in depth. And here we're going to look at this fascinating example of a cast bronze Greek sculpture. This is a life-sized bronze sculpture of a warrior. And we don't have a lot of Greek cast bronzes because they were melted down in later eras and used for armor, used for other works. Christians often found these works because they represented pagan gods. They often melted them down and destroyed them in acts of iconoclasm. But this work, what we see here in the photograph, is this work being unearthed from the Mediterranean. It was pulled out of the sea by a fisherman, actually not that long ago. And what we see here in the center is this work today in a museum. And on either side, we see what this work would have looked like in its original. So these are kind of scientific reconstructions. And we see an older warrior here. He has bags under his eyes. He has a kind of a little bit of a haggard facial expression, a little bit weary, pensive, but highly naturalistic compared to that New York Koros, right? Idealized anatomical forms. He would have had inlay in his eyes, lips, and teeth to add to that naturalism. So we have to imagine, for example, white inlay for his eyes, perhaps copper for his lips. And I'm showing you the reconstruction as well because it brings up another important point for us, and that's the idea of race in ancient Greece. That the surface chemical analysis suggests that he would have been quite dark-skinned and dark-haired, and this is a good reminder for us when we're only looking at these bright white sculptures. We forget the kind of ethnic diversity that would have been commonplace in the Mediterranean world. And this figure clearly does not have those kind of paler Northern European traits that we sometimes anachronistically associate with those white Greek marble sculptures. All right. For example, this one here, we see the discus thrower by a known sculptor named Myron, and he's captured in movement here. It's so interesting. Think about, this is the same discus event that we have in track and field today, and he's getting ready to swing the discus. Everything is lined up and ordered. The Greeks are trying to make something as wild as throwing a discus into an ordered, symmetrical event. The nudity is heroic and ideal, reflecting that growing interest in anatomy. And that is also reflected in the high classical period sculpture of the spear bearer. And if you're thinking, I feel like I've seen that name Polykleitos before, it's because the spear bearer is the model for the Augustus of Prima Porta, the Roman portrait of the first emperor that we looked at in our previous unit on art and power. Now, both of these works, the spear bearer and the discus thrower, we see how they have these awkward tree trunks here to kind of support the figures, prop them up. These are actually Roman copies, and they're not as sophisticated or elegant as the originals, but it's what survives to us today. And it also shows us how the Romans loved and admired the Greeks. Again, we see a very idealized figure, idealized musculature. He's in that contrapposto stance with the weight on one leg. It gives us that tilt in the hips, that slight turn of the shoulders. It makes him feel more lifelike. It makes him feel more real. And he represents what's called the canon, C-A-N-O-N, not like the weapon, of Polyclitus. And Polyclitus, our artist here, he developed this kind of mathematical system of ideal body proportions, relating parts to parts and parts to the whole, to kind of break down the human body into mathematical proportions to make it as idealized, as perfect as possible. All right, let's move into the late classical period here, and I think I'm gonna end with late classical and then save the rest for a third video. We're going to look here at one of the most famous sculptures of ancient Greece, and that is the Aphrodite of Knidos. Aphrodite is the Greek goddess of love. Her Roman equivalent is Venus. And we see Praxiteles here, he takes those classical standards from Polyclitus and he exaggerates them a little bit. Look at that strong S curve here in the body, in that kind of exaggerated contrapposto. Praxiteles, also gives us this kind of very soft facial features, the soft curves of the body. And he depicts Aphrodite in a very human moment. She's getting out of the bath, and I don't think many women feel their most kind of put together as they're, getting in and out of a swimming pool, for example. But here we see Aphrodite in that very kind of real moment. It makes her feel like one of us. It makes her feel relatable to see the goddess of love depicted in this kind of very private, kind of very everyday moment. It also emphasizes her sexuality, and that's the way we often think of Aphrodite today. When we come back, we're going to look at another depiction of Aphrodite. This is the Venus de Milo, another really famous sculpture, but I will save that for the next video to keep these in manageable pieces.